Howdy, and welcome to the F1 Hatchet. This is the post-race reaction for the Brazilian GP. What was your thoughts on this race? I thought it was one of the better races, if not one of the best races of the season. We didn't quite get the tire strategy down for the pit strategy to have a really interesting development on that side of it, but with all of the extra, competition and passes and side-by-side action that we saw during this race, I thought it was fabulous. It was one of the cool races at the very beginning. We had some issues, some contact that threw things around. We actually had issues before the race actually started, which was kind of delayed it a little bit, so that maybe built up some of that anticipation for this race. But overall, I thought it was a decent race. I thought it was a fairly good race. And then, of course, we had the ending, not necessarily for the first position, but for that third position between Alonso and Perez that came down to the wire of who was going to actually take that last podium position. So overall, I thought it was a fairly good race. But what was your thoughts on this race? Did you like this race? Did you think it was a really good race? Did you get bored because there wasn't a lot of extra going on in that middle to end part of this race stint? Anyway, I will go from the last to first through the drivers' positions and give you my thoughts on each driver and how well they did in this race. So without further ado, we will start off with Charles Leclerc, which he ended up having a hydraulic issue on the siding lap, which then caused him to send that Ferrari into the wall, causing him to actually not even start the race, which put him into last place. So it wasn't his fault, and I felt really bad for Charles because he was in that second position, and he could have made it a decent race, even though Ferraris were not the best at this track this weekend due to that only one session of setup. But he was definitely doing better than his teammate during the weekend, and so I thought he could have actually given it a little bit more running than he in this run for, in that top five. So I was kind of disappointed in him, and I'm sure he was disappointed in this race overall, not even getting to participate for the most part. Then we have Alex Albon, who qualified in 13th, had a really good start, and then got up on beside the Haas's and got squeezed between the Haas's, and ended up having Kevin Magnussen pushing him over into Hulkenberg, who then got contact and then spun him back into Kevin, and then I believe either him or Kevin got pushed into Oscar Piastri, the rear end of him, which caused some damage to that McLaren. And then, of course, the tire that got slung off of that Albon's car kind of went up and hit Daniel Ricciardo's rear wing. So there was lots of confusion and lots of chaos at the very beginning of this race due to that collision that ended up from a quick safety car to a red flag, which some people thought that red flag wasn't quite needed. But I think because of the debris and the actual repairing of those, those barriers to make sure that they were all looking good, it's probably a good safe maneuver in this running. Of course, then you have Kevin Magnussen, who was disappointed as well, qualifying in 12th. They were hoping to actually push and get some points in this race to help that battle out with in the constructor standings, but he wasn't able to do that because of the contact that he had. So it wasn't really, I don't think it's really anybody's fault. It wasn't Albon's fault. I don't think it was even Kevin's fault in the setting of that first lap. Everybody's trying to figure out where everybody is, trying to look left, trying to look right, trying to, look for the gaps in front of them and make sure that, people behind them aren't, coming in too fast, to maneuver all of that. So I really don't see it necessarily as Albon's fault, and I don't see it as Kevin's fault for trying to make that corner and ended up going 3 wide and just putting too much, squeeze on Alex Albon. But you might have a different opinion, but you can look at those reviews and see what you think. Guan Yu Zhou qualified 20th and ended up in 17th. He was actually doing fairly well But then he ended up having to retire that car on lap 24. I kind of heard was it was due to a water leak, so it wasn't his fault. And so it was kind of disappointing for Juan Yuzio to go out. I think he did decently. He had actually a pretty good start, gaining 6 spots on that first lap. So a really good start for him. And same thing with his teammate Valtteri Bottas. He had a 5 position gain on that first lap, but then he actually had to retire that vehicle on lap 40 due to a PU issue that they were thinking that it was probably going to give way or do something drastic, and so they had to retire that vehicle. So unfortunately for Alfa Romeo, they had 2 DNFs, so double DNFs on this session, and that was really hurt them in their running because I know they're trying to compete in that constructor standings to make sure where they end up. So basically having both of those cars out of the points or out of even the thought of having to get points was hard on Alfa Romeo. So hopefully they can figure out those issues and come back strong in a couple of weeks in Vegas, as that new track will probably have some conditions that they'll have to deal with in that area, because it's probably going to be a rough track since it's a street circuit. And of course, it's going to be at night, so it might be a little cooler. So who knows what that will do to the tires and suspension for those things as well. So we'll have to look at that and see what happens then. So not the greatest for them. I know they were running up there in decent positions, like in 12th and 13th at the beginning of this race. So looked like they were potentially could get into those points, but due to those car issues, they had to retire both of those vehicles for slightly different reasons. Then you have George Russell, who qualified in 8th and ended up in 15th due to him retiring that Mercedes. He was looking fairly good comparatively to his teammate, I think, even though those Mercedes were not looking very good this weekend, and they were really struggling on those straightaways. They were having a really hard time keeping all that together. But he was, kind of right behind his teammate, kind of trying to play the team game, trying to keep Sergio Perez behind them, but kind of wearing that out with that Red Bull behind them and being able to come out. And that was the one thing that, he's trying to figure out, should he be, putting pressure? Should he run his own race? Should he, how is that going to work with the Mercedes? So they have a little bit of talking to do between those two teammates, because I know on the radio they were like, well, we're still looking it over, trying to figure out what our strategy is, and that's not the best thing here as a driver. Trying to feel like, okay, tell me what I'm, what the actual strategy is during this race, so that I can actually meet that expectation. But he ended up retiring that vehicle on lap 59, so pretty deep into that race. What I heard was basically the oil temperatures in the PU were high enough that they had to basically retire that vehicle, thinking that there probably some dramatic failure coming imminent in that Mercedes. So it's good to see that Lewis didn't have that same issue, and hopefully they can figure that out again for the Las Vegas race in a couple of weeks. So that leads us all the way up to Oscar Piastri, who actually qualified 10th and ended up 14th. I don't think that was necessarily his fault. He ended up 2 laps down due to that issue. I think because he got kind of rear-ended through, I think it was K-Mag's car that actually going spinning after that contact with Albon, kind of hit the back of Oscar Piastri's car, and I think they were going to actually retire that car during that stint, but because of the red flag, they decided to try to fix that car. So they came back from the pit lane, a lap down, and then they were trying to fight their way back up. Him and Daniel were in that situation, and so being in that rear end spot really wasn't the best for them, but it probably gave them some good data that they can look at for the future. So hopefully they can do a pretty good running for them. I do have them that he was, had a good fight with Daniel, on those runnings between him and them. But Daniels, I think, ended up being a little bit ahead of him by the mid part of this race. So I don't know if there were still issues with that McLaren or if there were some other things going on that he just couldn't hang into that running. But falling back that far, I don't think necessarily was his fault. I think it was because of that contact at the beginning of the race. Then we have Daniel Ricciardo, which is kind of in the same boat. Qualified 17th and ended up in 13th. He was doing fairly well, I think, in this stint, except for that rear wing damage that tire collided with, and he ended up pitting and getting that switched back, which pushed him a lap down to start off with. But that AlphaTauri seems to have fairly good pace, and so I think he was able to work his way back closer to the back of that field, but still be a lap down in that running. So I think his stint, if you consider where he started due to that contact, was fairly good for Daniel Ricciardo, even though it doesn't quite look that way if you compare him and his teammate. But I do have him having that good fight with Oscar Piastri in that early running of this race. So that's always good to see. Nico Hülkenberg qualified in 11th and ended up in 12th. Not quite the running he wanted. I know they had some wing damage and some maybe tire damage that they brought him in for and swapped out tires before the red flag came out. And so he went from the softs that he started on to mediums, then basically went back to softs on the restart of the race, and then just swapped back to a couple of old softs throughout this race. And under that first stint, they were really having some issues with those soft tires that they had to actually burn through that, issue, the heat issue where it grained up and then where it came back to them. And so he dropped back a little bit farther into the pack and then had to work his way back up a little bit. Not quite where the Haas wanted to be. I think they're still struggling in that Haas to try to understand those upgrades that they brought, or understand how that Haas should be looked at for upgrades in the future. He ended up a lap down, but did a fairly decent job in this race, just trying to keep where he was, even though it doesn't look that great comparative, what you'd actually think of being in that 12th spot. You'd think he had a better race than he actually did. Then you have Logan Sargent, who actually had a decent race comparatively, starting off in 19th position and worked his way back up to 11th. He did pass Hülkenberg on lap 14th for that 14th position. And then I didn't see a whole lot of him, but I know he kind of worked his way up. And then, of course, when people started dropping out, that pushed them up into that closer to that point running field. I don't think they were really into that really competitiveness to actually get into the points. I think they were two enough behind, but it's still a good showing from Logan Sargent. He actually did have a fairly good start and gained 4 spots at the beginning of this race, and then he kind of worked his way up throughout that first stint. And then, of course, when people started dropping off, that pushed him right next to that point running position. So it's kind of disappointing. I know he was disappointed not to be able to really push into those point running, but I don't think he really had a chance in that Williams, even though Albon's probably might have gotten up there. He could get the most out of that car, whereas Logan's still trying to figure out the basics on the tire strategy and that Williams to get the most out of that Williams to kind of compete with his teammate. So, of course, this is his rookie year, so we'll have to see how he ends up, or if he even ends up in that Williams, as he may be thrown out and someone else coming in. But I think from everything I've heard, that really behind Logan, and that might even give him another year, kind of like Yuki did, to see how he proceeds on that second year. So hopefully we'll see that and see what he can do. This leads us to the top 10, where we have Esteban Ocon, who kind of struggled in this race. He did gain 3 spots at the very beginning of this race, but then was in that, right in that conflict area. And so he had to really kind of work on this, the settings on that Alpine. And of course, the Alpines did a lot better in this race than I was going to give them credit for, especially after that sprint race. I was thinking they'll be in the back of the pack, but they both made it up into the point running spots. So that's really good to see that Alpine is doing that well. I do see that Ocon passed Hulkenberg on lap 39 for 13th. He did a 3-stop race, starting on softs, going to a mediums, and then back to softs in this race. Kind of doing a fairly good job, but just kind of in that wrong part of the race where he couldn't really gain as much ground fighting with those vehicles around him like Yuki and Hulkenberg in that scenario to start off the race, and then kind of getting into that rhythm, being kind of off kilter as he pitted fairly early on that first stint on lap 15. So kind of got that off strategy going that didn't quite work out as well as they were hoping to in that Alpine. Then you have Yuki Tsunoda, who I think did a pretty awesome job, qualifying in 16th and ended up going all the way up to 9th. Yuki Tsunoda gained 5 spots at the very first lap, which was really good to see. He had a good fight with Gasly on the the first part of this race. I have him passing Bottas on lap 36 for 10th, and then passing George on lap 58 for that 9th position. So passing, Mercedes in those AlphaTauris, it's kind of interesting to see, that difference in vehicles, what you would think that would be the true difference, but not quite there. And of course, the Alpines the same way. I mean, they're closer to those Mercedes, but they're not like, where you would think the Mercedes would be. So having those battles with those Mercedes is always kind of interesting to see. And of course, when you have the sister team of Red Bull actually passing Mercedes, that's always kind of a burn in the sense of that running, that their sister team, they're not their, the main team is actually competing with that running. So it was really hard to be a Mercedes fan in this race. As we can see with Lewis Hamilton, ended up starting in that 5th position, but ended up dropping back into that 8th position. He did gain 2 spots at the very beginning. He did pass Stroll at the start of the race to kind of get him into that, 2nd to 3rd spot. I guess it was probably the 3rd spot because of Norris. Kind of fighting that really run at the very beginning. But then the straightaways, kind of kicked in, and they didn't have the, the main straightaway speed. And then even in the corners, they were kind of lagging behind, struggling in that Mercedes to keep up with the rest of the folks. So kind of wearing their tires out. I know Lewis was ready to get rid of that vehicle as soon as he could. And actually, even at one point, I think he was saying that he was having some like a right front issue where it was not behaving quite as well as he was thinking it should have been either, which is always kind of puts pressure on the mechanics to try to figure out what's going on in that Mercedes. Of course, we're going into that unknown of, Las Vegas in a couple of weeks, so maybe they can fine-tune that Mercedes a little bit better, having, the full practice sessions on that track to see if they can get the most out of that. But that drops him back a little bit farther out of that driver's championship of that 2nd position with Sergio Perez. So unless something really drastic happens, I think he is stuck in that 3rd position. So Pierre Gasly actually had a really good race as well in that Alpine, coming in from 15th all the way up to 7th. He actually was probably one of the better drivers for the day, I would have thought, if it wasn't for him or Fernando Alonso. Those are the people I would have probably kind of put my money on, that drivers of the day. but it ended up going to Lando Norris. But I think Pierre Gasly did a fine job in that Alpine of actually pulling everything he could out of that Alpine, because they weren't actually expecting anything, especially after yesterday's sprint race. This kind of came together for them in this running. He did gain 3 spots of the first lap, and then basically passed Sargent on lap 30 for 11th, passed Valtteri Bottas on lap 32 for 9th, passed George on lap 43 for 8th, and then swapped out positions with Ocon for that 9th position, as he ended up running a little bit faster than Ocon, kind of dropped back a little bit farther, and then kind of worked his way back into that points of 7th position throughout this race. A really good stop. He did 3 stops as well, so it was kind of good to see him kind of maintaining. Actually, no, I think he did. Yeah, he did 3 stops. So good to see Pierre Gasly, getting the most out of that Alpine. It's really nice to see those Alpines actually being more competitive, as they've kind of dropped off a little bit in the last few races. Carlos Sainz ended up starting this race in 7th and gained a position overall to that 6th position. He was struggling all weekend in that Ferrari, not doing what he was thinking that it could be doing, but he maintained it. He actually lost a position on the start of the race, but was able to gain it back in a couple other positions to getting up to that 6th position again. Mainly playing defensive for the most of this race, but doing fairly well. I know he was saying he was having clutch issues in this race. I'm not sure if that was just settings that they had him set up for, or if there was some actual clutch performance issues that they need to work out for before the next race. Anyway, I have him doing a decent job. He passed Ocon on lap 28 for 8th, passed George on lap 35 for 7th, and then passed Lewis on lap 37 for 6th, where he kind of ended up maintaining that position for most of the rest of that race. Kind of a little bit behind Lance Stroll, not being able to really keep up with the Aston Martins, but keeping the rest of the folks behind him. So more of a defensive race, not where the Ferrari wants to be, but still getting decent points for Ferrari, keeping the Mercedes behind. So that's always good to see if you're a Ferrari fan in that regard. Then you have one of the outstanding peoples as well. Even though they started a little bit farther up the grid, Lance Stroll started in 3rd and dropped a couple of spots back to 5th. I didn't have the best starts, but it's good to see Lance Stroll. I mean, I know there's lots of talk about him and whether he deserves to be in that seat. But today he actually did perform fairly well in that Aston Martin, gaining into that 5th position, gaining some really good points for Aston Martin overall. He didn't have the best start, losing 2 positions at the very start of the race, but was able to pull those back up through attrition and just sheer pull of that Aston Martin over the rest of the field. Not quite where the Red Bulls are or the McLarens, but kind of in that running for this race, at least in that right behind that pack. So I see that he passed George on lap 25 for that 9th position, and was able to through where those Mercedes kind of dropped out, was able to pull himself back into that 5th position, just ahead of Carlos Sainz. Then we have Sergio Perez, who ended up starting this race off in 9th. Made it all the way up to 4th. At one point, we were actually going to have a podium with Sergio Perez, but just like, a half a tenth of a second, like 0.05 or something like that, seconds was that he lost and ended up into that 4th position. He did a fairly good job gaining more confidence in that Red Bull, getting closer to his teammate on those lap times that we saw. Not quite exactly where he needs to be, but it's a good improvement over what we've seen more recently in his runnings. Did a decent job getting in there and pulling himself back into point range. And of course, it was really good to see him, gain that point spread again over Lewis. So he's not quite in that threat of losing that second position in the driver's standings. He still can lose it if something drastically goes wrong, but if he keeps his head cool, he should be able to maintain that second position, which would give a Red Bull sweep. So that's what they're looking for at this point in time. He did gain a couple of positions at the start of the race. He passed George Russell on lap 14 for 5th, passed Hamilton on lap 18 for 4th, and then they pitted and they came back in for on lap 23. He had to repass Hamilton for 7th, and we passed Alonso on lap 70 for 3rd, and then or was it Stroll that he passed? But he was at the very end. I mean, he was he had passed Alonso on that. I think it was next to last lap, and then Alonso was able to come back and pass him on the last lap. And then at the very end, he was coming down that main straightaway and was just a hair shy of taking that third position from Alonso. So good to see him fight for those positions and really get the most out of that Red Bull, starting a little bit farther back in that field. So decent running, good prep for him, and of course that repassing of Hamilton was the one thing that we saw with the tire strategy and the pit stops that kind of pushed a little bit where they kind of got Hamilton back out in front of Sergio Perez, which made him repass him on the track. So that was the one strategy-ish thing that we saw during this race. The rest of it was pretty much on track passing. So for a fan, I know that's really neat to see all the on-track passing and all-track battles that we got to see in this race. The end part of it was, the very end was really good. There was that little stint in there that was kind of like just running to maintain the tires, kind of right behind each other for the most part. So that kind of got a little bit boring, but overall, really good race. And I think Sergio Perez did a really good job of getting back into the points and potentially have gotten on that podium, but just missing out. Fernando Alonso was, of course, it's Fernando Alonso, and that's probably the reason he was able to maintain that third position. He started off in 4th, gaining one spot at the very end. He was doing a really good job. He passed Hamilton on lap 4 for 3rd. And then on the restart, he was able to, kind of catch that in and pass Perez on lap, as I said, on that very end part. So Fernando got out there into that third position fairly straight off the bat, kind of maintained that third position through most of this race. Not really keeping up with the top two, but was, relatively ahead of the rest of the field until Perez started making his way back in and getting into that, DRS zone, and then having to play defensive near the last few laps of this race, last 10 laps or so of this race. He had to play a lot more defensively or drive defensively, and then thought he actually had lost that when Perez made it past him, but then I think what he said was Perez actually made a slight mistake and was able to retake that position from him. And so he was thinking it was all good. And then, of course, at the very end, Perez started coming back, and it was just like that 0.05 seconds from retaking that third position from him. So a really good race for Alonso in that Aston Martin, as they weren't really expecting, I think, to be in that third position. I think they were expecting to be closer to that 4th or 5th position in this race. But really good to see him pull all of his racecraft out and just really bring that Aston Martin onto that podium and dragging it as much as he could into that podium position. And then, of course, we have Lando Norris, who started the race in 6th and then ended up in 2nd. Lando had a good start at the very beginning of this race, made it up to 2nd before they red flagged it. So he started the restart in 2nd position, actually put a little bit of pressure on Max Verstappen, giving it all he could, and then basically didn't quite make it in front of Max. Max was able to maintain that first position. And then I think basically he realized that he had to maintain those tires for a longer stint. And so kind of fell back into that 2nd position, and then kind of that gap kind of increased over the next several laps from Lando to Max. But he was kind of what it sounded like he was maintaining the lap speeds of Max Verstappen and around most of those times until they got to the end of that tire stint. So the last 5 laps of each tire stint, he started losing time to the Red Bull, which the Red Bull was able to gain those gap between the McLaren and the Red Bull stint. So that gave him a little bit of breathing room that Max needed to just kind of pull out and maintain that lead without too much trouble. Of course, Max started off the race in 1st and ended up in 1st. He had a good start at the beginning, maintained it, and had a good start at the restart as well to maintain that first position, even with all the chaos behind him and the threat of Lando on that second the restart, the second start. So Max Verstappen had a 5.3 second lead over Norris at halftime, which was, about 35 laps. So not too bad of a gap. I mean, it's still a decent gap, but not what we've seen in the past. Then on lap 50, he had a 6.9 second lead. And at the end of the race, he had an 8.1 second lead. So it wasn't the 20 seconds over the sprint race that we saw. And it wasn't, the 30 or 40 seconds we've seen in the past. So we've seen that gap a little bit increase. Now, he probably could have had some in reserve that he could have just pulled out. He could have just been able to maintain those speeds and those tire issues as messy as he could throughout this race without having to actually put pressure on those tires to, get graining or whatever. So really good on Max. And then, of course, I'll go back to Lando on his gaps between him and Alonso. I think he had an 8.3 second over Alonso at that 53 lap mark. And then, was it lap 60? He had a 9.9. And then, or actually, that was the anomaly that I read. I'm not sure if I wrote that down correctly, because at lap 50, he had a 27.3 second lead over Stroll. And then by the end of the race, he had a 33.9 second lead over Alonso. So I'm not sure if I misread that 60 lap mark or not, but he was able to really maintain the gap between that second position and that third position for Lando. And then, of course, Max was able to just keep that first position overall. So a really good running for those first 2 positions. And we had, of course, the big fight for that third between Fernando Alonso and Sergio Perez, which gave us that ending excitement that we were looking for in this race, even though the first of this part of this race was, super interesting and super, thrilling, and all of the changes that we were seeing and the incidents that we kind of ended up having to figure out what was going on. That middle stint kind of got boring to a certain degree, but I still love this race. What was your thoughts of this race? And of course, Lando was driver of the day for the 3rd time in a row, I believe, and he also got the fastest lap, so he got that extra point. So what did this do for our driver standings? Well, we still know that Max has won the championship in Qatar, so he has nothing to really prove, but he's still improving that gap over his teammate. So he's now at 524 points over Sergio Perez, 258. And then basically we see Alonso jumping up to that fourth position above Carlos. And then, of course, Lando jumping above Carlos as well. So Carlos was the big loser even though he got points this race, dropping back to sixth. And then we have Lance Stroll jumping over Pierre Gasly, who still got points as well. So that's that tight battle for the top 10 positions. And then, of course, we have just the tightening up a little bit of Yuki Tsunoda gaining points but not really in the running for that 13th position, but trying to solidify that 14th position over Valtteri Bottas. So, did this do anything for the constructor standings? Not really. We still have Red Bull with 782 points in the lead over Mercedes 382. Ferrari has a little bit farther behind with the 362. The big battle here is the Aston Martins with 261, gaining some ground on McLaren with that 282. Alpine kind of helped that battle out for that sixth position. There's no way that they can drop down to that seventh now that they have 108. And then, of course, Williams was hoping to gain some points. And AlphaTauri is kind of coming back on them. So there's some potential that they could swap with AlphaTauri in that 8th and 7th positions there. But nothing has changed in this regard for this race. So what is coming up? Well, we have the Las Vegas race, not this weekend, but next weekend. So we have a weekend off, and then we have Las Vegas. And it's like the Heineken Silver Las Vegas, which I'm not sure if that the Heineken Silver is part of the main name for this circuit or if it's just the Silver Las Vegas race. It is a total length of 3.853 miles, with going to have 50 laps run for a total distance of 192.656 miles. And of course, this is introduced, first time it's going to be introduced in this season. So it's 2023, and there's no current lap record for this track. In fact, I'm not even sure if they're going to have a DRS zone in this track layout. As we can see, everything is white currently. Now, we do have some weird times, at least for me, and the central time zone for the U.S. Of when these are going to be run, because I think the race is actually going to be closer to midnight when it's run, so just be aware of the timing, as it's going to be a night race in Las Vegas. So keep an eye on those times. And if you made it this far, I would appreciate a like because it helps with the Google algorithms. And if you want to see my reactions for the Las Vegas GP race, then please subscribe, as I will be giving that during that weekend. Until then, I will see you on the grid, and farewell.